Maude Butcher had occupied her sprawling acreage in absolute solitude for decades. To the corporate prospectors who arrived in polished leather boots and bespoke suits, she appeared to be nothing more than a frail, elderly black woman with no cavalry to call upon. Silent, sequestered, an effortless mark. They presented financial inducements, followed by coercion, and finally brutality. Tires slashed, livestock toxic, a timeline dictated. Yet they failed to perceive the history she bore within her, years spent as a military sharpshooter, conflicts waged in the hush of distance, victories secured in the shade. Consequently, when they approached under the cover of darkness to seize what belonged to her, they encountered a force they had never calculated. Maude did not collapse. She engaged as if the war had never ceased. Before we proceed any deeper, take a moment to comment below regarding where on the globe you are tuning in from, and ensure you subscribe immediately because tomorrow's narrative is one you simply cannot afford to miss. The dawn unfurled with that specific, quiet elegance that only soil cultivated by memory can provide. And as the initial flush of amber light kissed the peaks of the hickory trees, Maude Butcher positioned herself at the brink of her veranda, a ceramic mug of coffee unwavering in her right hand, her vision tracking over the vast stretch of farmland she had inherited, shielded, and memorized down to the final root and furrow, as though every inch was woven into her very DNA. At 74 years of age, her spine remained rigid, her stride purposeful, and her respiration tranquil. This was not because time had been merciful, but because she had dedicated a lifetime to conditioning her physiology to respond solely to discipline, never to terror, never to agony, and most definitely not to intimidation. The residence behind her, humble in its facade but fortified in the aspects that truly counted, was maintained in a state of operational perfection, not for guests, as they were a rarity, but because order was the dialect she spoke most fluently. Nothing in Maude's existence was abandoned to fortune. The draperies were drawn with a consistent cadence. The range scrubbed the instant it lost heat, and the porch swept with symmetrical motions regardless of whether the wind had been gentle or vicious the previous night. Her territory was more than a dwelling. It was a perimeter, a duty, and a breathing continuation of every instruction combat had etched into her marrow. She had always understood that the dirt beneath her soles contained narratives far more ancient than the structure itself. And when she commenced noting the minute disruptions in the soil horizon near the northern quadrant, the subtle chemical scent drifting up after a tempest, the slight discoloration in the drainage, the way her late husband's vintage geological journals had quietly alluded to what might rest deep within the crust, she did not succumb to panic, nor did she rejoice. Rather, she conducted her own evaluations, collected specimens, and without whispering a word to a living soul, triggered the sluggish and legally complex procedure of locking down her mineral rights through an attorney she relied upon 3 counties over, a man who was indebted to her for more than one service, and possessed the wisdom not to utter her name within a public bureau. It was a silent operation, as meticulous and calibrated as any sort she had commanded while in uniform. And yet, even with every safeguard active, the intelligence seemed to drift on a breeze she couldn't track. Because mere weeks after the paperwork commenced, unfamiliar vehicles began manifesting near her access road. Initially stationed on the gravel verge, then creeping incrementally closer, always sporting obscure tinted glass and pristine white chassis that clashed violently with the dust-caked locals who actually toiled on this earth. The occupants wore no insignias, yet their bearing betrayed them. Too loose for standard contractors, too vigilant for vendors, and possessing eyes that swept the skyline like men accustomed to entering spaces they already planned to dominate. The first occasion one of them ascended her driveway, he did so with a grin so glossy it appeared to deflect the sunlight. Clad in a button-down shirt with cuffs rolled to the elbows, sleeves casually styled as if to feign approachability. Although the brittleness in his tone held the same severed edge as a man unaccustomed to being disregarded, he announced himself as an envoy of a real estate investment faction with a focus on strategic rural procurements, and stated his group had caught wind of her land's worth, and wished to extend a proposal that honored her heritage while granting her the liberty to savor her remaining years burden-free. She had not invited him to rest. She had not extended coffee. She had listened without a blink, her silence expanding just long enough to compel a spark of unease across his otherwise assured visage, and when he finally extended a crisp envelope with gilded typography along the seal, and politely insinuated she contemplate it. She accepted it without a syllable, and waited until his departure before she even broke the seal. That twilight, as the sun submerged behind the ridge, and the cicadas flooded the dusk with their throbbing cadence, she stood solitary at the fringe of her pasture, the envelope gaping in her grip, and the bid inside staring back in bold, shameless font, a figure so substantial it might have caused another woman to hesitate, perhaps even fantasize. But Maude merely angled her head a fraction and gazed out over the soil she had bled for, labored for, interred a husband in, and defended for decades, not because it was profitable, but because it was hers in every conceivable sense that held weight. She did not falter. She did not sigh. She marched back into the dwelling, unlatched the iron furnace door, and fed the proposal to the fire, observing without sentiment as the document blackened, shriveled, and transmuted into soot. Her face was washed in the soft pulse of heat that signified, in her universe, a boundary had just been traversed, and there would be no withdrawal, no parley, and no alert the next time someone arrived inquiring about the contents of her subterranean ground. By daybreak, the carbon from the letter had cooled into a delicate gray strata at the bottom of the heater. The sole tangible proof of the verdict already cemented in her psyche. Maude cleansed her mug, cinched the laces on her combat boots, and moved on to the veranda with the breed of tranquility that required no proclamation. The morning radiance stretched across the meadows in elongated amber ribbons, and for a fleeting second, the scene appeared unchanged. The remote timberline static, the barricades upright, the gravel path hushed. But there was a shift in the atmosphere, something nuanced, akin to the sensation of a tempest looming just beyond the curvature of the earth, concealed, yet undeniable. She navigated to the municipal court as the village was barely rousing. The thoroughfares remained vacant, the shops secured in quietude. Her pickup rumbled steadily down the fractured tarmac, the cargo bed bare, her passenger seat occupied only by the manila dossier she had assembled weeks prior. She had autographed everything sluggishly, intentionally, her script stable across every document. It was not merely ink. It was assertion, purpose, fortification. The courthouse foyer reeked faintly of floor wax and decaying rug. The sort of aroma that seemed imprisoned in the molding regardless of the years elapsed. Maude entered, offered a curt nod to the security officer, who scarcely lifted his eyes from his puzzle, and proceeded toward the archives counter where a youthful clerk with excessive hair product and a badge-reading Toby sat behind a smeared partition of safety glass. She glided the dossier across the ledge without utterance. He peered up, performed a rapid double-take as if anticipating a different visitor, then accepted the papers with a theatrical exhale, as though processing administration from a woman of her demographic at that hour somehow fell beyond his employment parameters. He skimmed the cover sheet, struck a few keys, and mumbled something sotto voce about archaic filings being a nuisance to categorize. Maude offered no voice. She merely observed. His digits danced across the input device, too rapid for accuracy. And when the terminal confirmation display materialized, he paused just long enough to flick his eyes toward the corridor leading to the sheriff's department. He reached beneath the ledge, slid his mobile device from his thighs, and without a glimmer of disgrace or nuance, dispatched a text with his thumb hovering over the glass like a man performing a vital yet mundane task. She catalogued the way his gaze avoided hers when he returned the receipt. No pleasantry, no valediction. Outdoors, the sun had ascended. The morning had commenced its warming, yet the frost in the depth of her gut had no correlation with the climate. The clerk had transmitted a signal. That implied someone would arrive shortly, and indeed they did. The luxury SUV pulled in 2 days subsequently, late enough in the forenoon that the mist had evaporated, early enough that the neighbors would be absent. It navigated the drive sluggishly, tires too pristine, suspension too fluid, the breed of machine that belonged in exclusive garages, not on dirt trails. Maude was stationed on the porch already, arms at her flanks, attending. She had not visibly armed herself, but her posture was sufficient. The male who exited donned a rich midnight blue suit that appeared bespoke but consciously unfastened at the neck, a pair of tan boots with dust smeared just adequately to feign wear, and a countenance that attempted to broadcast empathy but failed to fully shroud the calculation. His flaxen hair was swept back with rehearsed comfort, and his eyewear dangled from the second button of his shirt like a prop in an advertisement. "Miss Butcher?" he queried, advancing as though assuming she would meet him midway. She remained rooted. "I am Silas Vane," he stated, halting for a pulse as if the moniker should carry weight. "I represent a consortium that partners with heritage landowners, individuals such as yourself who have constructed something precious and might be prepared to shift into the subsequent chapter." She elevated a brow. He persisted. "I desired to converse with you personally, respectfully, before matters became overly bureaucratic. You possess an exquisite tract of earth here, historical, solid foundations, and beneath all this rustic appeal, well, let's just articulate that there is genuine equity waiting to be liberated." He allowed that final term to hover in the atmosphere, like a vendor testing the limits before unveiling what he already presumed was his advantage. "I am not vending," she declared monotonously. Silas grinned. But it was the variety of grin that failed to extend beyond the edges of his lips. "Naturally not. No one is imploring you to hasten, but we wish to place an option on the table, merely so you comprehend the potential. We are not here to disparage your heritage. Heaven knows you have anchored this location longer than most could, particularly considering everything else transpiring out here." He permitted his gaze to drift across the terrain as if seeking proof that she was incapable of its management, as if the autumn foliage and fissured earth were evidence that chronology had finally conquered her. Then he extracted a petite envelope from his interior jacket pocket and deposited it delicately on the veranda rail adjacent to her. "Review it when you are prepared. There are more zeros than headaches. That I vow." Maude did not glance at the packet. She gazed at him. "You traveled out here to inform me I do not belong on my own soil." His smile constricted. "Not remotely. I arrived to offer you an alternative. We prefer to collaborate with people who grasp that the world is evolving. This is not intimate. It is merely commerce. You have done admirably to cling to this spot, Miss Butcher, but we both realize. Land like this, it will not remain peaceful much longer. You might as well acquire something while you can still designate it as yours." There it lay, not in the vocabulary itself, but in the delivery, the presumption that she was ignorant of her own best interests. The silent insinuation that a woman of her nature, black and aged, and dwelling solitary on a parcel that white men now coveted, must seemingly have overlooked the notification that it was time to release her grip. He uttered nothing profane. He did not elevate his volume. But Maude had existed long enough to identify the timbre beneath the etiquette, the domination buried within the civility. She collected the envelope, weighed it in her palm without breaking the seal, and uttered, "Are you concluded?" Silas angled his head, visibly startled. "Because if you are not, proceed. I possess time," she continued, voice level, yet threaded with iron. "But if you are, then gather your boots and your proposal and vacate my property before I cause you to forget every currency unit inside this envelope." He did not grin this time. He offered a rigid nod, inhaled one slow breath, and marched back to the SUV without a further syllable. As he motored away, kicking up a vortex of dust that loitered long after the machine vanished past the tree line, Maude remained motionless on the porch, the envelope still in her grasp, and hearkened to the breeze rolling in across her pastures like a hushed warning already acknowledged. The subsequent days unraveled with an abnormal quietude, as though the terrain itself were suspending its respiration. The village, which had already commenced a shift in mood, now felt depleted of cordiality entirely. Residents who once gestured from verandas or paused to converse outside the supply depot now traversed the avenue when they spotted her approach, their eyes darting rapidly toward the pavement, as if something regarding her existence had turned radioactive or worse, branded. No one vocalized anything explicitly, but the hush surrounding her felt less like a void and more like a tactic. As though they were shielding something or someone by maintaining their range. She detected it first in the manner the shop assistant sacked her provisions without meeting her gaze, or how the fellow at the fuel pump, who used to jest about the climate, now went rigid when she halted beside him. It was not precisely dread, nor was it sympathy. It was the identical look she had witnessed on juvenile recruits standing outside barracks in distant deserts, the sort that informed you they had already resolved not to get too proximate, not to care excessively, because they had no desire to feel accountable for the ensuing events. Back at the homestead, the signals became less understated. The initial event was the tire. She discovered it the morning following a deluge, the earth still pliable enough to display the mold of boots in the mud, though the impressions had been smeared by a sweep of foliage, like someone had strived too hard to conceal their path. The front driver's side wheel of her pickup had been lacerated. Not profoundly enough to generate sound or halt her instantly, but sufficient to fail if she had exceeded 40 on the expressway. Sufficient to invert a vehicle if the synchronization was precise. She did not curse, did not telephone anyone. She simply replaced it, annotated the coordinates in her logbook, and retrieved a more extensive route chart from her bureau drawer, one that provided off-grid navigation lines in the event the highways became treacherous. A few evenings later, her hydraulic line ruptured without alert. Initially, she presumed it was antiquity. The copper conduit had been laid decades prior. But when she extracted it from the soil to assess the ruin, she discovered the fracture was crisp. Too crisp. The alloy snipped with something far keener than erosion and chronology. That night, she pasteurized rainwater and consumed it without remark. The ensuing morning, she bypassed her filtration reservoirs and commenced stockpiling emergency rations in hermetic vessels. It was not until she patrolled the goat enclosures near twilight and discovered her eldest doe lying on her flank, rigid and distended, that the boundary between caution and proclamation was finally traversed. The beast had been vigorous, aged, certainly, but feeding well, moving reliably. There was no indication of a conflict, no proof of sickness, only the signature froth at the muzzle and the inflammation in the articulations that testified to intentional toxicity. Maude remained there for an extended period, one hand propped against the rail, observing the final insects alight on the corpse like shadows with wings. She interred the goat personally at the fringe of the northern pasture, denoting the sepulchre with a rock she etched nothing into. That evening, as the sun slid low and the illumination stretched across the meadows in elongated, honey-cooled streaks, she descended into the basement beneath the larder and unsealed the fortified locker that had not witnessed daylight in over a decade. Inside, her precision rifle rested in flawless alignment, swathed in lubricated fabric, every component cleansed and verified annually on her name day, out of custom more than readiness. She unwrapped it sluggishly, auditing the optic, calibrating the zero, tracing her digits along the chassis as though decoding Braille. It was an elongation of her form, as intimate to her as her own respiration. She produced her sidearm next, charging it with systematic care before sliding it into the holster fastened against the interior of her waistband. She returned to the veranda, not with terror, not with fury, but with a hushed sense of arrival, as though some long-dormant segment of her had merely been awaiting authorization to awaken. The subsequent few days were consumed traversing the land in measured silence, not to appreciate or reap, but to inventory, diagram, and condition. She navigated the fields with a measuring tape, a magnetic compass, and a carpenter's chalk string, plotting range against line of sight, tagging every organic blind spot and altitude advantage. She drafted a chart by hand, pinpointing angles of ballistics, auxiliary firing stances, and bottlenecks near the barricades where her property narrowed between the oaks and the cliff. Snare wires were positioned at shin elevation, looped with delicate copper filament, and veiled with hay. She engineered perimeter alerts using scavenged radios and pressure triggers concealed inside inverted feed pails. The glazings were measured, blackout curtains hemmed and sewn with dense cotton to ingest luminescence. The barn was fortified from the interior, fortified not with timber or spikes, but with anticipation. Every night prior to slumber, she took a stroll under the moon, tallying her strides, watching for snapped branches, gauging silence by the lack of insect song. Then, on the sixth dusk, just as the shadows thickened and the atmosphere adopted the metallic aroma of oncoming precipitation, the SUV returned. Only this instance, it did not arrive solitary. 2 additional trucks trailed, darker in hue, their headlamps extinguished, their rubbers slicing slowly across the gravel. Maude stood at the brink of her porch, hands nestled into the deep pockets of her coat, not shifting, not blinking, as Silas Vane emerged from the lead transport. The male beside him was loftier, broader in the torso, with sleeves rolled sufficiently high to display service tattoos eroded by time or poor decisions. Silas did not wear the same burnished confidence as before. This time there was no charade, no envelope, no preambles, just a lengthy, wordless march to the bottom stair of her porch, where he halted, peered up at her with something that was not quite a sneer, and stated in a tone stripped of all charisma. 2 weeks. That is all you possess remaining to regain your sanity. He glanced toward the dwelling, toward the stable, toward the skyline. After that, he continued, his voice depressed and flat. You will be unable to halt what is approaching. And you will be profoundly regretful you did not accept what we proposed when it was still intact. She did not vocalize. She did not stir. And when he finally pivoted to stride back to his truck, the sole noise was the breeze slipping through the maze and the low drone of his motor as it idled in the expanding gloom. The night following Silas's admonition passed without occurrence, but it delivered a silence that was too sterile, too absolute, like the stillness of a corridor right before a portal bursts wide. Maude dozed lightly, boots adjacent to her cot, rifle within grasp, every inhalation calculated, every sinew resting just beneath the veneer of preparedness. By daybreak, her resolution had solidified, not as a reflex to dread or vanity, but as the only rational conclusion when confronted with a menace that no longer feigned to be anything else. She commenced her arrangements the same way she once had in the peaks of Afghanistan, by traversing the soil, not as a cultivator, but as a warrior, reconfirming terrain she already comprehended by intuition. Every nook of her acreage became a variable in a formula. Every elevation point an advantage to be noted and exploited. She moved intentionally through the herbage, kneeling frequently to imprint her palm into the dust, testing for malleability, gauging depth, accounting for how the planet would shift beneath the mass of boots, not her own. The initial trip wires went up at the fringes of the western pasture, obscured by desiccated foliage, and set low enough that no one would spot them unless they crawled. Copper filaments stretched between stakes that appeared to be fractured fencing, but were in reality carefully positioned anchors. Each one rigged to a sequence of buried chimes and compression switches linked to an archaic CB radio network she had reconfigured manually. When the wires tripped, the transmission would actuate a silent tremor beneath her floorboards. Not a noise, not a glimmer, just a murmur through the skeleton of the house that someone had penetrated the outer ring. Inside the barn, she vacated the central aisle, relocated the livestock fodder to the distant wall, and reinforced the portal with 2 massive oak girders she had retained for just in case, though she never articulated what the case would be. From a hatch beneath the grain silo, she hoisted a corroded tin chest caked in grime and sealed with a cipher lock, her late husband's, undisturbed since the year he perished. It required a moment to recall the sequence, but her digits located it before her intellect did. The muscle memory outpacing thought. Inside were the vintage journals bound in canvas and replete with his diminutive, fastidious script. There were annotations on hydraulic conduits, gas pressure readings, seismic data capture long before contemporary scans validated what he already surmised. Tucked in the creases of the final ledger was a plasticized map scarred with red grease pencil slashes, locations across the estate, notated in a code only she and he could decipher, glyphs for observation posts, visual corridors, fallback sectors. Beneath the map, swathed in oiled linen, was the external drive. It bore no tag, no identifiers, just a black carapace and the heft of something abandoned, not for inquisitiveness, but for endurance. Maude set it aside, cognizant it would come into play subsequently, realizing the data it contained would possess worth, either as a bulwark or an armament. She expended the next 3 days wiring the dwelling and land with concealed optics small enough to nestle in tree cavities and rail posts powered by solar modules and fed into a laptop she preserved under the false bottom of her writing bureau. The monitors flickered to vitality quadrant by quadrant until the entire estate unfurled in live visuals. Every timberline, every portal, every approach, visible through at least 2 vectors. She scrutinized them for hours, tuning lenses, recalibrating slopes, noting where her own blind spots lingered. That is when she discovered the initial scout lens. It had been positioned high in a sapling near the eastern gradient, camouflaged adeptly, but not adeptly enough for someone who had dedicated a career to spotting glints of steel from hundreds of yards away. She ascended the ladder with caution, detached the unit, and pried it open on the tailgate of her pickup. It was not amateur technology. It was sleek, miniature, and fed into a secured uplink. She pulverized the internal processor with the heel of her screwdriver, tossed the husk into her incinerator barrel, and then orbited the perimeter until she located the second one tucked beneath a faux knot in the rind of an ancient hickory near the stream bed. This one she did not annihilate. Instead, she rewired the broadcaster, looped its feed, and supplied it footage from 2 days prior. Tranquil land, no snares, no movement. A still life designed to deceive the gaze. If they were observing, they would now be witnessing nothing whatsoever. That night, she reached out to Gideon. He responded on the 3rd chime, his larynx rough from whiskey or slumber. Though with Gideon, it was difficult to distinguish which arrived first. "You returned to the fold?" he queried before she even uttered her identity. "I never departed it," she rejoined, her tone submerged and steady. "You calling implies you require a sweep," he stated. "4 square miles stitched. I require thermal signatures, recent impressions, anything traversing the timber boundary. I will transmit it in 24. I will extract from my NOAA reserve, should be pristine. Ensure it is. If they are monitoring my soil, they are monitoring everything." A hiatus followed, not from skepticism, but from comprehension. "You solitary?" he asked. "I am sufficient," she uttered. He did not dispute, just vented through his nostrils and said, "You always were. Verify your inbox tomorrow." She terminated the connection without valediction. By the subsequent dawn, she had relocated her primary sniper nest to the antique silo. Its steel skeleton still robust despite the decades, now cleansed and converted with sandbags, blackout canvas, and a mattress she severed from the guest quarters. From this altitude, she possessed lucid views of the thoroughfare, the northern thicket, and all 3 approach vectors. She unlatched her rifle case, snapped the magazine into position, tuned the optic by half a click, then lay prone with the stock welded against her shoulder. Her eye synchronized to the glass. Her respiration decelerated, and the breeze whispered through the fissures in the metal partitions. She chambered the final cartridge and murmured to herself with a timbre that did not quiver, did not oscillate, did not fracture, not a supplication, not a malediction. Just the identical phrase she had whispered in every nation, every operation, every instant, where the trigger was her dialect, and silence was the rejoinder. 0 wind. The heavens had folded themselves into ink by the time the initial tremors reached the footing of the residence. Maude, lying flat in the loft of the silo, sensed the subtle shudder through the chassis of the rifle before she visualized anything. A cadence in the gravel, soft but purposeful, like boots striving too hard to mimic footsteps left by deer. She did not adjust. She did not blink. Her cheek remained fused to the stock, her eyes unmoving behind the lens, the crosshair tracing the moonlit gradient that led to the boundary line near the cattle gate. Then came the illumination, or rather the void of it. 3 sets of headlamps extinguished in sequence, as the trucks crept in sluggishly. The way carnivores orbit when they have concluded patience no longer signifies. The vehicles fanned out without resonance, their hatches opening with the breed of prudence that only originates from men who anticipate a skirmish, but assume they will be the ones directing it. Tactical footwear landed in the soil. Gauntlets adjusted on forearms. Suppressed armaments hoisted into ready stances. None of them gazed upward. They maneuvered in synchronized silence, spreading into formation like they had rehearsed it. She tallied them as they advanced. 4 disembarking from the lead truck, 3 from the second, 2 more trailing in gloom from the third transport. Their apparatus was streamlined, dark, fabricated for rapid, sterile tasks. They were not here to intimidate. They were here to conclude. She exhaled once through her nostrils slowly and squeezed. The initial man never detected the discharge. The projectile transited through his neck just above the clavicle, the exit trauma blooming silently across his left shoulder before his knees surrendered, and he folded laterally into the herbage like a sack of feed. The others did not perceive initially, too fixated on spacing and motion to realize they were already deficit 1 operator. When they did, the second round was already departing the muzzle. It impacted the next target just as he stepped past a fence post wired with an obsolete gravel mine. The shot snagged him through the ribs, staggering him into the wire. A second later, the filament snapped, and a burst of honed stone detonated upward from the buried canister she had constructed from a repurposed fertilizer drum. The clamor was not loud enough to reverberate, but it fractured the quiet like crystal, and suddenly someone bellowed the word she had been anticipating. "Sniper!" The formation dispersed, but they were already too exposed. She shifted positions without wavering, sliding backward from the nest on her abdomen, never elevating more than an inch off the floorboards. Within seconds, she was down the ladder and traversing the field along the irrigation trench, the one she had carved deeper over the prior week to afford her a covered corridor between firing stances. Muck clung to her elbows as she crawled. Rifle slung tightly across her dorsal. The sidearm at her hip mute, undisturbed. She did not require it yet. They were engaging now, blind, erratic, and terrified. The muzzle flares stuttered from behind the storage shed and tree leans, but the aim was too elevated, too tardy, too frantic. She could discern they had trained, but not for this. Not for someone who comprehended the land better than they comprehended their own command hierarchy. Not for someone who had been terminating in silence since before most of them could shave. She attained her second nest, tucked into the ruination of an old hay barn, the girders reinforced with sandbags, the crawl space beneath draped in burlap and coated with grime. The meadow ahead was now strewn with motion, shadows bobbing between timbers, someone shouting position digits that signified nothing in terrain this irregular. She retracted the bolt, fed in the next cartridge, and aligned the glass. Another man collapsed, this one mid-sprint, a precise strike to the thigh that toppled him face first into the fro. He attempted to crawl, dragging himself through sodden grass, but she was already dialing the range to finalize him. She did not pull the trigger immediately. She observed him for a few seconds, his digits clawing into dirt, his lips moving like perhaps he thought a prayer could halt what was arriving. She pulled. The quiet after each discharge was worse than the discharges themselves. It settled across the pastures like a second epidermis, draped over the planet as if daring anyone to speak, to respirate, to believe they possessed control of the night again. But they did not. She did. Down near the eastern barricade, one of them triggered a second snare, a trip wire rigged to a garden hoe and a propane flare. The eruption of brilliance ignited the underbrush for just long enough to expose 2 more targets who had ducked behind a stack of cordwood. She could not strike them both from this angle, but she fired regardless. One fell, the other fled, screaming into his radio for support. She switched positions again. Each relocation was computed, each nest pre-built with minute comforts she had earned through repetition. Water flasks, a rolled towel to rest her arm, a field chart scratched into timber with nail points. She rotated through 4 stances before the trucks even conceived to reverse, before the tires finally spun through the mire in retreat, dragging the injured and the rattled back into their steel cocoons. The final thing they anticipated was to be stalked by a woman with silver in her hair and phantoms in her marrow. The atmosphere inside the residence had already transmuted by the time she reached the rear portal. It was not the odor of smoke, or cordite, or hemoglobin. Those arrived later, but the nuanced disruption in the barometric pressure, the kind that whispered of open entries and boots tracking across hardwood that had never known strangers. Maude crouched low behind the coat rack in the utility corridor, her sidearm drawn, her physique balanced on the balls of her feet, her breath shallow and gauged. The breach had not been explosive. They were attempting to remain quiet, to move like shades in a place built for specters. But her ears snagged every plank creak, every whispered signal between men who had drilled for urban raids, but not for the dwelling of a woman who had spent her youth threading fatality through structures far less forgiving than this one. The first one moved through the scullery, rifle angled low, flashlight flicking in wide arcs across the cupboards and ceramic. Maude let him pass the pantry before triggering the smoke canister she had stashed in the oven's unused lower compartment. The chamber filled in seconds, dense white haze swallowing every silhouette. She moved through it like fluid, silent and precise, her shoulder grazing the edge of the breakfast counter as she ducked behind it and tallied the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The second man entered through the flank window, feet landing softly on the kitchen rug she had rigged with roofing nails punched through the underside. His shout was muffled, more agony than astonishment, and she utilized the noise to mask her motion, sliding in behind the first man and striking the crook of his elbow with the butt of her pistol. The weapon clattered from his grip. He pivoted, stunned, only to receive a sharp strike to the bridge of his nose. Blood splattered the icebox door behind him as he stumbled backward into the basin. She did not waver. Her left hand came up beneath his mandible, knife angled tight between fingers. She drove the steel into the soft space just under the chin and twisted sharply to the left. He dropped without a resonance. A flash of light to her right warned her of the third man just before he opened fire. The projectile grazed her shoulder, the heat of it tearing through the outer fabric of her jacket and biting into skin with a sting sharp enough to jolt but not decelerate her. She dove behind the dining table, already reaching for the second smoke canister, tossing it overhand toward the corridor just as a boot struck the edge of the table, tipping it sideways and sending porcelain crashing. The flare hissed as it ignited, spraying sparks into the stairwell. The hall lit up in bursts, pulsing crimson like a heartbeat too loud in the ears. She saw the shadow of the shooter first, tall, fast, moving too confidently, and as he stepped forward, she fired from the ground, low and tight, catching him in the left knee. He went down shrieking, the gun spinning from his hand and bouncing once before skidding into the baseboard. She rose quickly, shoulder searing, and retrieved the blade from her belt. Blood dripped onto the floor as she closed the distance between them, breathing hard but silent. And then, without ceremony or pause, she drove the knife into the base of his neck. He twitched once, then was still a creak behind her, small, deliberate, someone moving slow. She did not turn. Instead, she spun the desk lamp nearest her, casting its cone of light across the far end of the hallway, then dropped low, crawling under the table as the intruder entered from the rear stairwell. She watched his legs move past her hiding place, steady, careful, his breathing controlled. He was astute, checking angles, ignoring the distractions, but not astute enough. Maude reached up and pulled the cord on the swing lamp just above the bookshelf. The movement drew his eye for half a second, long enough. She lunged forward and stabbed upward, the blade slipping through the bottom of the lampshade and into his chest with a force that rattled the shade itself. The man gasped, staggered backward, and collapsed into a chair, gurgling as his lungs filled with fluid. Only then did she pause, leaning against the edge of the wall, panting, her hand pressed to the bleeding groove along her shoulder. It was not deep, but it would need binding. Not yet. Outside, the gunfire had faded, the others having retreated, regrouped, or been taken down by her traps and optic. Inside, the only sound was the labored breath of one last man still alive, barely. He lay face down near the kitchen entry, his rifle out of reach, his hand clutched around his side where she had struck him with the blunt edge of her blade, knocking him unconscious just moments before. She pulled a zip tie from the pocket of her coat, rolled him roughly onto his stomach, and bound his wrists with practiced speed. Then, with a grunt and one final breath to steady herself, she dragged his limp body down the hallway, through the back door, and across the yard toward the barn. Blood streaked behind her, dark and glistening in the cold moonlight. The war had entered her house. Now she would take the fight into theirs. By the time she secured the barn doors behind her, and stepped back out into the field, the land had already begun to shift again. It was not the wind or the trees that moved, but the air itself, thicker now, heavier, pulsing with the kind of tension that comes not from fear, but from the certainty that what is coming next is built for destruction. The first wave had been a trial, an underestimation. The next would be something else entirely. She made it halfway to the front pasture before she saw the silhouettes. Larger this time, moving in tighter formation, heads low and shoulders square, like they had done this before in places where mercy was not written into the mission. The trucks did not stop at the road. They surged forward with engines cut and lights off, their tires rolling silently through the gravel and mud as if they had trained for darkness and silence the way she had trained for silence and death. She counted 9 men on foot, moving fast. Bodies bent beneath the weight of heavier gear. Breech kits, shields, canisters strapped to packs, hammers in hand, their movement too clean for hired muscle and too reckless for law enforcement. From her vantage point behind the irrigation tank, she watched as 2 of them approached the back entrance, crouched low beneath the living room window. One of them held a gas canister, the other a sledge, and both looked up at the same time, nodding once before preparing to strike. She did not wait. With a flick of her wrist, she triggered the tripped wire that ran from the kennel post to the base of the porch steps. The wire, invisible in the dark, snapped back the latch on a flare rigged above the gutter. And in a sudden burst of shrieking light, the front yard ignited in a blinding white blaze. They staggered back instinctively, shouting for cover, but the confusion had already begun to spread. 2 more men who had circled wide toward the south pasture ran straight into the claymore equivalent she had buried beneath the false trough. The explosion was not deafening, but it was precise, sending shards of jagged rebar and thick wet dirt into the side of the tractor and one of the attackers with it. She moved fast, darting from the tank to the garden trench, her shoulder flaring in pain with every stride. The leg wound she had taken during the earlier fight had tightened, stiffening with cold and dried blood, but it did not slow her. She reached the comms jammer beside the compost bin, a reconfigured field radio connected to a solar power cell, and a frequency disruptor she had purchased second-hand from a ham operator with questionable loyalties. She powered it on and slid the dial to the dead zone between law enforcement and commercial radio bands, watching the green light flash once, then hold. Their radios would be useless now. They would not even know why. Shots rang out near the barn. Wild, scattered, desperate. She dropped flat against the row of overturned soil, crawled until she reached the fence post near the willow tree, and sighted in through the scope she had mounted on her backup rifle. One of the attackers had taken shelter behind her wheelbarrow, firing into the dark like it might answer him. She steadied her breath, exhaled, and squeezed. He dropped forward into the dirt, his body limp before it landed. At the house, they finally breached. The back door splintered under the weight of the hammer, the metal frame snapping with a groan that echoed across the yard like a church bell fractured by fire. Maude knew they would come through the kitchen first, that they would stack, clear, and assume their speed gave them the upper hand. What they did not know was that she had removed the refrigerator from its usual spot and replaced it with a frame-mounted steel rod bent at an angle set just above eye level. She reached the porch seconds after they entered and slipped through the broken siding on the north wall. Moving through the smoke-filled hallways, she used their confusion against them. 2 were already blinded by the flash flares, rubbing their eyes, weapons swinging low. A third moved with intention, pressing through the smoke, barking orders that did not match military cadence. She ducked beneath a swinging flashlight beam, pressed herself against the pantry wall, and waited for the thud of his boot to pass the threshold. Then she struck. The rod connected with the side of his head just above the ear, and the man dropped instantly, collapsing with a grunt into the floorboards. She reached down to roll him over and froze. Silas. His face, even bloodied and slack-jawed, was unmistakable. The same smug curve to the jaw, the same polished arrogance now collapsed in a heap beneath her kitchen light. She bound his hands quickly, dragged him by the shoulders through the hallway, and left him behind the upturned dining table before returning to clear the house. When the sun finally rose, it did so without drama. The field smoked in soft tendrils, patches of churned earth glowing faintly in the new light, and her porch was littered with debris, broken boots, spent magazines, a gas mask hanging from the rail like a piece of shed skin. 3 of them were alive. 2 of the subordinates lay unconscious in the grass near the west field, both stripped of weapons and gear, their arms tied behind their backs with electrical cord. Silas remained inside, groaning now, shifting slowly like he had expected to wake somewhere easier, softer, safer. Maude stood at the top of the porch steps, her body slick with sweat and grit, the blood on her shirt a mix of her own and others. Her breathing was even. Her eyes scanned the treeline, the road, the horizon. And when none of them moved, when no more trucks appeared, no second wave behind the second wave, she exhaled slowly, let her shoulders roll forward slightly, and whispered the same words her husband had once said after they had survived a 36-hour siege in a forgotten compound on the edge of nowhere. That is all of them for now. Then she stepped down into the grass, her boots silent on the blood-wet ground, and went to collect what they thought they could leave behind. The barn, in daylight, looked unchanged to anyone unfamiliar with its second purpose. The wide red doors, worn smooth by time and sun, hung slightly crooked on their hinges, and the rusted latches still bore the marks of years gone by. Inside, however, the space had transformed, not into something grotesque or monstrous. Maude had never needed theatrics to make her point, but into a place where silence was thick and deliberate, and every creak of wood or drip of water served a purpose beyond its sound. The 3 men sat bound to reinforced chairs she had bolted into the concrete days ago. Each positioned at a slight angle from the others, just far enough apart that they could not whisper, could not see each other's expressions, but could hear everything. Their wrists were zip-tied, their ankles secured with paracord pulled tight against the floor brackets. Duct tape had sealed their mouths during transport, now removed with a slow, deliberate hand, not to grant them speech, but to measure their reaction to its return. Maude did not speak for the first hour. She moved around them with quiet efficiency, adjusting lights mounted on portable tripods, wiping blood from her temple with a cloth soaked in cold rainwater, resetting the battery on the small field recorder she had placed on the shelf above Silas's head. She let the barn settle into itself, the distant ticking of a leak in the roof, the wind pushing through the slats high along the back wall, and the slow, steady rhythm of water dripping from a metal bucket suspended just above the concrete near the far door. Every sound was intentional, and none of it was rushed. She poured water from a tin kettle into 3 canteens, left them just out of reach on the ground, then turned on a single hanging bulb that swung lazily above them, casting long shifting shadows across the barn floor. When she finally pulled up a folding chair and sat facing them, her expression was unreadable, not hard, not cruel, just quiet, and entirely in control. "You came here to erase me," she said, her voice low and steady. "You failed." No one answered. One of the subordinates, wiry, younger, breathing through clenched teeth, shifted slightly in his chair. The other sat completely still, eyes closed, either conserving energy or pretending indifference. Silas met her gaze without flinching. Blood dried across his jaw where she had struck him. His right eye beginning to swell shut, but his expression remained composed as if his training still whispered that posture was strength even here. Even now, Maude stood, walked slowly to the back wall, and picked up a small handheld speaker connected to her recorder. She pressed play in the room filled with the sound of gunfire, boots in mud and distant voices shouting fractured commands from the night before. It was not just sound. It was proof, a timeline, a record of what had happened when they thought they were still in control. When the recording ended, she turned to the younger man. "You want to tell me who is giving orders now?" she asked. He did not speak. She nodded once and walked to the light, tilted the bulb directly into his face, and stood silently as the heat began to work on his resolve. 10 minutes passed. 20. The sweat started to form at his temples, then trickled down his neck. He shifted again, blinked hard, swallowed dry air. Maude did not touch him. She did not shout. She simply moved the water bottle an inch closer, then stopped, letting the silence do the rest. "I am not dying for this," he muttered at last, voice cracked and raw. "Who are you dying for then?" she asked, crouching slightly, her voice calm and even. He hesitated. We do not know names, just layers. We are told when, where, how the money comes from out of state. Transfers, cash drops, sometimes fake construction bids. And Silas? She asked without looking at him. Middleman, the man whispered. He tells us what land to clear. She walked over to Silas, crouched in front of him, meeting what was left of his gaze. You want to keep playing the professional, or should I let him keep talking? Silas smiled, but it was tight now, hollow at the edges. You are not going to kill me, Miss Butcher. No, she said, but I do not need to. She pulled a folder from the shelf, one of her husband's. She laid it open on the table beside Silas's chair, flipping through pages marked with land registry codes, transfer documents, and surveys all tied to the property surrounding hers. You have been here before, she said. Years ago. Quiet purchases, forced liens, families that left in the middle of the night. You were part of that wave too, were you not? Silas did not answer, but the flicker in his expression was enough. She slid a photograph across the table, grainy, black and white, taken from a drone years ago, showing Silas standing with Rourke outside a state land auction office. You think no one was watching? She said. You think my husband did not see what was coming? Silas's lips parted slightly. He inhaled but said nothing. She leaned in, voice quiet now, nearly tender. You ever tell your daughter how you make your money, Silas? Because I will. I will tell her, and I will tell the courts, and I will send the audio to every paper west of the Mississippi if I have to. His jaw clenched. Sheriff Rourke, he said finally, his voice like gravel in his throat. He gets the names. He gets the filings. He knows who to lean on. The rest of us cleaners and the registrar, she asked? Silas nodded once. Her job was to delay your paperwork. You were not supposed to file in time. Once the window closed, we move. Claim squatters' rights. Stage a chemical spill. Condemn the land. Same play as always. Maude pressed stop on the recorder. Then stood. You put me on a list, she said, her voice low now, filled with something older than anger. You had no idea what kind of name you were crossing out. She walked to the door, opened it to the cold morning light, and let the silence hang behind her like a judgment waiting to fall. Inside the barn, the men remained bound, but the story had already started to break. She did not return to the house right away. Instead, she walked the edge of the property line, one slow step after another, her boots pressing deep into the still wet earth, the cold morning wind curling through the trees with the kind of hush that only followed a night of violence. The barn doors remained shut behind her, their interior still cloaked in the weight of confession. And though the sun had fully crested the horizon, nothing about the light felt clean yet. There was a knowing in the air now, a shift, not just in what had been done, but in what had been revealed. By the time she stepped through her front door, the adrenaline had dulled to a quiet ache in her joints. Her hands, still lined with dried blood, moved with muscle memory more than thought, as she lit the stove, boiled water, and poured herself a cup she never drank. The cup sat cooling beside the window while she reached into the drawer below the sink and pulled out the old green ledger she had not touched in years, the one her husband used to keep tucked beneath the third floorboard in the bedroom, marked only by a frayed ribbon and a single faint cross on the spine. The journal was not what it seemed. It never had been. The first few pages were lists, fencing materials, feed calculations, rotational crop plans, but after the second section, the entries changed. The writing grew tighter, more deliberate, and the dates became sporadic. Maude recognized the structure immediately. Operational shorthand, one they had used in the field when notes had to be disguised as logistics or inventory. Her husband, who had walked away from service with injuries no one could see, and a mind that stayed locked onto mission cadence, had embedded a cipher in his pages, just in case someone ever came looking to understand what he had not been ready to say aloud. She turned the journal sideways, angled it beneath the morning light, and followed the diagonal lines marked faintly in red pencil, coordinates hidden in supply totals, names buried in expense columns. The patterns were old but familiar, and as she decoded them, the truth began to take shape with painful clarity. He had known about the gas years ago, not from a neighbor, not from a company report, but from a quiet contract signed by an out-of-state agency that had flagged the mineral content beneath their land as high value. He had not told her because he had been working to slow the process from within, using outdated surveys and technical obfuscation to stall exploration permits. He had not wanted her to worry. He thought he could buy them time, but someone had found out. The entries near the back grew darker. There were notes about meetings with a state officer, a man who had promised confidentiality, who had taken copies of the forged maps, and said he would bury them beneath other filings until the political winds shifted. Maude read the dates carefully. One stood out, circled twice in black ink and followed by only one more line written in a hand that had started to shake. Meeting confirmed. Rourke's name came up. Need to be careful. That was the last entry. Her husband had died in a single-car accident on the highway back from that meeting. The truck found crumpled in a ravine. The report said the brakes had failed. No autopsy was ordered. Sheriff Rourke was the first on the scene. He had personally delivered the folded flag and the condolences. Maude closed the journal, her fingers resting on the frayed edge of the last page, her breath shallow but steady. The noise outside, birds, wind, the distant groan of tree limbs faded until there was only the pulse in her ears and the weight of understanding settling in her chest. This had not been about a land grab. Not entirely. It had not been just about the gas or the title or the money. It had been cleanup. A final piece of a plan started years ago, unfinished because her husband had stalled them too long. She had not just become a target because of the mineral rights. She had become a target because she was married to a man who had made it his mission to keep those rights hidden and who had died for his trouble. She stood slowly, walked to the living room, and opened the drawer where she kept the last photograph of him, the one in uniform, standing beside her on the day they came home together for the final time. His smile in that photo was not forced or cautious. It was whole. So that is why they really came, she whispered. Her voice did not tremble. It carried the kind of quiet finality that sounded more like ceremony than grief. Outside, the barn remained locked. The men inside, unaware that the story had shifted again, not just in their failure, but in the reasons behind it. Maude sat at her husband's old desk and opened the field radio, dialing into a frequency they used to joke was for emergencies only. Static buzz for a moment, then cleared. She keyed the mic and leaned in. "Gideon," she said, her voice low but deliberate. "I need you to pull the accident report from March 23rd, 8 years back. Franklin County, 1 fatality. I want every line of it. Witness statements, signatures, and the name of the responding officer." The pause on the other end was brief. "Copy," Gideon said. "That is going to take some creative reach." "I do not care what it takes," she answered. "And I want the drill site registry logs for anything filed near County Line 17 in the last 10 years. Look for aliases, out-of-state LLCs, anything that crosses with Rourke's name." He hesitated. "You are not slowing down, are you?" Maude did not blink. "No," she said. "I am just getting started." She set the mic down and picked up the photograph again. There would be no more half measures. Not this time. The house was still, but there was no rest inside it. Maude moved with a calm sharpened by clarity. Her body worn but unyielding, her wounds bandaged tightly beneath her sleeves. The storm had passed outside, but the real work, the kind built not on gunpowder but paper and proof, was only beginning. The confessions were still fresh in her ears, but she did not play them back. She did not need to. Every word was etched into memory now, and memory, unlike tape, did not fray or skip. In the corner of the room, the old field laptop hummed softly, its fan whirring just loud enough to remind her that this part of the fight would require precision of a different kind. She inserted the SD card, the red one marked with an X in her late husband's handwriting. A relic of habit, long before external drives replaced most of their field tools. The files loaded without error. She opened the folders one by one, checking audio levels, scanning for timestamp mismatches. Each file was labeled meticulously. Confession 1, Silas Vane. Confession 2, Operator Number 3. Confession 3, Target Sequence Breakdown. A master folder contained geotags, land records, corrupted transfer receipts, and a side-by-side comparison of the delayed filings cross-referenced with Rourke's name. Proof, not speculation. She encrypted the backups to 3 separate drives, 2 physical, 1 virtual, and placed one into a hollowed-out floorboard beneath the hallway rug, another into a waterproof pouch she buried beneath the azaleas in the west garden. The virtual version was uploaded to a secure cloud hub run by one of Gideon's old surveillance contacts in Nevada. Someone who owed them more than a few favors and did not ask questions unless he was trying to keep you alive. By noon, 3 identical packages sat on the table, plain cardboard, sealed with craft tape, each one addressed by hand. One to a small investigative newsroom out of Mobile that had a reputation for chasing corruption cases the bigger stations would not touch. One to a state government watchdog group that had sued Rourke's office twice in the last 5 years. And the third, the heaviest, bound for a retired federal prosecutor now running a legal podcast that had just last month publicly questioned the legitimacy of land seizures across the state's southern counties. Each box contained a thumb drive, a transcript, and a note written in Maude's measured hand. You do not know me, but you know the pattern. Here is what it looks like when someone survives it. She drove the parcels herself, using the old truck with the stolen plates Gideon had sent her last spring as a joke that had become useful in a way either of them expected. She mailed each package from a different post office in 3 different towns, pausing in none of them long enough to register as familiar. At each stop she left a small piece of her silence behind and carried nothing back but air. That night, with the barn secured and her house again dark but fully wired, she sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook to a name she had not written in years. Selina Graves. She had seen her once years ago giving a talk at a veterans' rights rally about environmental displacement and legal protections for underserved landowners. The young lawyer had spoken not with anger, but with clarity, and clarity, Maude had learned, was rarer than rage in most people who fought against systems like this. Selina had since made a name for herself, challenging corrupt pipeline contracts and winning 3 injunctions against state-backed drilling corporations tied to interstate fraud. Maude had not needed her before. She did now. She placed the call just after 10 o'clock. The phone rang 5 times before a calm, no-nonsense voice answered. Selina Graves, this is Maude Butcher. You do not know me. But you have been tracking my land. A pause, then the sound of a laptop keyboard tapping. You filed the mineral claim out of Franklin. 72 acres filed late, but it stuck. That is right. What happened? They came for me at night in numbers. Did you defend it? Yes, Maude said, and I recorded everything. Selina's tone shifted, not with disbelief, but with engagement. Do you have documentation? 3 audio files, 2 names, 1 signed order blocking the mineral registration forged by a county registrar. I have Rourke tied to LLC transfers and a confession that includes the phrase, she was always on the list. There was a sharp exhale on the other end. Then silence. I have a press connection at the Ledger, Selina said finally. And I am 2 weeks away from filing an ethics suit against the Energy Land Board. If I bring this to court, it changes the entire foundation of my case. Are you safe? Safer than they are? Good. Then here is what we are going to do. They spoke for over an hour, moving through details like 2 officers planning a joint operation. Selina would coordinate the press release, anonymous source at first, but authenticated through geotagging and confirmed metadata. She would file for an emergency injunction on behalf of Maude, then expand the case to include whistleblower protection once the information went public. A civil racketeering charge would follow, naming Silas Rourke and the registrar supported by the filed evidence, the audio confessions, and Maude's testimony. By the time Maude hung up, the legal fuse had already been lit. She leaned back in her chair, the ache in her shoulder settling beneath the surface again, and stared at the old wood beams above her head. This house, battered and patched, and braced against storms, both natural and man-made, had held. It would keep holding. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows, not howling, but whispering, as though the land itself had taken a breath. In the barn, the men remained tied, and the recorder clicked softly on its timer, logging each hour as further proof of life. And somewhere beyond the trees, far from the blood-soaked ground they had tried to take, Sheriff Rourke was already starting to feel the tremble of something he could not stop. The barn stood quiet in the distance, its weathered siding cloaked in morning mist, the rising sun casting long streaks of amber light across the yard. From the outside, nothing stirred. But within its walls, beneath the steady click of the timer, and the faint rustle of shifting weight, the unraveling had already begun. Not with shouting or violence, but with silence and consequence. A reckoning that moved like groundwater, slow, unstoppable, and deeply rooted. The digital files were already gone, scattered across encrypted channels, funneled to news outlets, legal archives, and government watchdogs with precise timing and complete anonymity. Silas's voice, raw from confession, echoed across audio logs that matched bank records and land surveys, connecting names and faces that had long stayed hidden in plain sight. Every thread they had pulled was a thread Selena Graves could trace. In Atlanta, Selena moved like a machine. Her office light never fully dark. Her phone constantly blinking with pings from whistleblower networks, investigators, and reporters trying to piece together the scope of the operation. With Maude's help and Gideon's old radio scans, she charted a corruption web that extended far beyond Rourke's county badge or Silas's muscle. It bled into corporate acquisitions, political campaign donations, public grant misallocations, each layer hiding under the next like rot beneath polished floorboards. She followed money that had crossed oceans, cycled through offshore trusts, bounced through four-digit shell firms, and reappeared as bribes disguised as property adjustments. She mapped it all and did not say a word until the whole picture stood in front of her. When the moment came, it did not arrive with fanfare. The federal raids moved just before dawn, deliberate and quiet, engineered to catch every door unlocked and every server still online. Black SUVs moved through gravel back roads and dark alleys coordinated from a central command hub 2 towns over. Agents carried paper warrants sealed in tight packets, their movements as sharp as their timing. No announcements were made to local media. No early tips were leaked. The silence was strategic. They hit 7 locations in under 30 minutes. 2 large estates, a private airstrip hangar, a satellite office downtown disguised as a real estate agency, a riverfront lodge used for off-grid retreats, and 2 nondescript homes belonging to board members of the State Energy Commission. Each one housed boxes of unfiled paperwork, encrypted hard drives, and decades' worth of liability waiting to be exposed. Maude watched none of it on television. She sat at her husband's desk and stared at the grain in the wood, her hand resting on the same radio she had used to call Gideon only days before. She was not interested in headlines or photos. She had no desire to hear talking heads debate whether her actions had been legal or excessive. The land was still hers. Her name was still hers. That was all she needed. Meanwhile, Rourke's attempt to flee unfolded with a mix of arrogance and desperation. He had driven 3 states over in a rented SUV, his passport, a forgery bearing a Florida birth date, and a Mississippi license number that had not been valid in over a decade. He checked into a roadside inn under the name Leland Gibbons and paid cash. He bought new clothes from a local hunting shop, shaved in the mirror with trembling hands, and tried to vanish into the kind of quiet places he used to patrol with impunity, but the net had already closed. He was pulled over by a state trooper just past the levee. The vehicle flagged before he even crossed the county line. Inside the SUV, they found burner phones, a stack of cash and foreign currency, and a map with 3 border crossings circled in red ink. He did not protest the cuffs. He just looked off into the trees as if they might open up and offer him one last escape, but there were no more exits. Back on Maude's land, the men she had left bound in the barn remained right where she had placed them, silent, still, and in no position to run. She had not spoken to them since that final recorded confession. No threats, no questions, no gloating, just food left within reach, water refilled, and a heater humming low in the corner. Enough to keep them from freezing, but not enough to offer comfort. When the first federal agents arrived on her land, she met them at the gate with no weapon in hand, only a folder containing passwords to the encrypted backups and the digital key to her own logs. She pointed toward the barn and said with a calm that carried no pride and no hesitation, "3 inside, all armed when they came, all alive now." They nodded, thanked her, and proceeded without another word. The agents processed the captives without incident, noting the medical attention they had already received and the clear evidence of restraint, not cruelty. The men were shackled and led away. No longer soldiers or enforcers, but witnesses and evidence in a case they never thought would leave the county line. Silas, for all his bravado and threats, gave a full deposition within 48 hours. Faced with a wall of evidence, federal charges, and a string of accomplices eager to trade stories for lighter sentencing, he accepted the role of whistleblower. His testimony sealed 3 federal indictments and helped accelerate subpoenas against 2 sitting state energy commissioners. Back at the courthouse, Maude's paperwork, once stalled, lost, or conveniently delayed, moved through without friction. No more clerks side-eyeing her. No more misfiled signatures or forgotten stamps. Her legal title was restored, mineral rights secured, and ownership reaffirmed at every level. When asked if she would be willing to appear in court or on camera, her answer was the same. No interviews, just closure. By week's end, the headlines had changed. What began as a missing permit case in a forgotten township had become a national story of land theft, corporate conspiracy, and one woman's refusal to yield. But Maude did not watch the broadcasts. She stood near the barn, staring at the scarred dirt, where trucks had once rolled in and bled back out, where boots had pressed deep into her ground with arrogance, thinking she would fold. She did not fold. And they would never forget the cost of underestimating her. The indictments came swiftly once Silas's statement was entered into evidence. In a sealed courtroom session attended by federal prosecutors and forensic auditors, his confession matched with GPS logs, recorded wire transfers, and internal correspondence pulled from seized servers became the keystone in a case that had been quietly building momentum behind the scenes. One by one, members of the State Energy Board, city zoning officials, and regulatory agents who had rubber-stamped illegal contracts began submitting their resignations. Some cited personal reasons. Others vanished behind non-disclosure agreements, but the headlines told a clearer story than any official memo. A coordinated effort to defraud vulnerable landowners in favor of a syndicate hidden behind shell companies and offshore accounts. The men tied in Maude's barn had been transferred into FBI custody by the time the morning sun reached its peak. She had left the barn doors open deliberately so the agents could see the evidence without obstruction. They found the captives fed, bandaged where necessary, and seated beneath a blinking camera that had logged every hour of their captivity. Maude had kept everything clean, no bruises that did not come from the fight, no injuries inflicted after surrender. They had been given blankets, water, and medical aid. One of the agents, after reviewing the footage, simply nodded and made a note in his report. Subject used non-lethal restraint and demonstrated clear intent to preserve life once targets were incapacitated. There were no further questions. As for the ones who had not lived through the night, their bodies were recovered with care, tagged and bagged by professionals who knew better than to ask Maude what had happened in the dark. The evidence told the story for her. The propane flare near the firewood stack, the shrapnel pattern by the southern fence, the deep impressions left behind by the breaching hammers still clutched in dead hands. Each piece aligned with her account and matched the timestamps from her mounted cameras. The federal report would later classify all 10 deaths under defensive action taken during an organized armed assault. It was a legal term, but one that carried no stain on her name. Sheriff Rourke did not run far. After failing to cross state lines using a falsified identity and a rental car procured under an expired drilling license, he was taken into custody by a quiet task force stationed at the county line. His suitcase held more than fake credentials. It held a thumb drive encrypted with bribed records, land grab directives, and a partial list of targeted properties. Maude's name was circled in red ink. He had no chance to speak for himself in court. His arraignment was closed to the public. and though his mugshot leaked within hours, the press release simply read, "Charged with conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice in a multi-state fraud case." He was denied bail. Selina Graves handled the rest with surgical precision. She and Maude reviewed every document together at the old kitchen table where the war had begun. It was there, beneath the soft light of a single lamp, that they laid out the paths for restitution. Maude's mineral rights were not only honored but secured under full federal protection through a clause in the Whistleblower Land Security Act, a provision rarely used, but invoked in light of the attempted land seizure and violence she had endured. The rights were irrevocable. The land could never be touched without her express permission. No more loopholes, no more games. When Selina offered Maude a seat on the advisory board for the new Land Protection Coalition, named in honor of her fight, Maude declined with the same quiet certainty she had carried through the worst of it. "I did not do this to join another room full of people with opinions," she said plainly. "I did it so the next black woman holding a deed does not have to pick up a rifle just to keep her ground." Instead, she used part of her settlement, not the hush money from lawsuits, but the clean federal payout tied to protected mineral claims to establish the Butcher Land Trust. Its mission was simple: to locate, defend, and preserve black-owned farmland across the South. No politics, no cameras, just quiet paperwork, legal firepower, and permanent ownership that could not be stolen by forged bids or buried clauses. The men who had come for her never spoke her name again in court. Silas pled to a reduced sentence in exchange for everything he knew, which turned out to be considerable. The two men captured beside him accepted plea deals as well. Their silence traded for time. None of them saw the inside of her barn again. And the land itself, the fields that had once hidden traps and soaked up blood, grew quiet again, not in the sense of forgetting, but in the way trees remember storms without needing to speak of them. Grass regrew over the buried safe. The fence post stood tall once more, and in the far corner of the property, where the dirt ran redder than anywhere else, Maude placed no marker. She let the wind have that place. When asked later why she refused every media request, every feature article, every invitation to speak, she answered only once. And it was to Selina sitting on the porch one evening as the sky bled orange behind the hills. "They already got my story," she said. "I do not need to sell it back to them." The new boards on the shed did not match the old ones. They were smoother, paler, and still smelled faintly of sawdust and fresh stain. But Maude did not mind. She ran her hand along the grain, feeling the clean lines where chaos had torn through weeks ago. Around her, the sounds of rebuilding were soft but constant. The low scrape of a trowel, the rhythmic thump of boots against dirt, the occasional hammer tap when someone found a stubborn nail. None of it was rushed. The volunteers who showed up did not come with speeches or sympathy. They came with tool belts and thermoses, old habits from lives spent in uniforms, carrying quiet knowledge of what it meant to lose something, and then build again. The shed was first, but not the last. Across the western acres, a new structure rose slowly over the summer, low to the ground, broad in its footprint, with rooms that opened onto wide porches and halls designed without corners. It was a retreat built not for ceremony or accolades but for use. Veterans came from counties near and far, some wearing their fatigue in the curve of their spines, others in the way they looked at tree lines. A second too long. They did not ask what had happened on the land. The wind still carried the echoes, and the dogs made sure no one got too close without permission. But they respected the quiet, and that was enough. Selina visited now and then, usually on weekends, bringing updates on legislation, land rights victories, and sometimes just cornbread and black coffee. She always parked in the same spot, just shy of the willow tree that leaned over the gravel drive like it had been listening through the whole fight. Maude kept her company on the porch, where the two women sat without urgency, without needing to fill the space with anything more than presence. Occasionally they talk about the trust, how many acres had been added, what counties were next, how to handle new threats wrapped in friendlier language. But more often than not, they simply watched the sun go down. One morning, just after dawn, the front screen door creaked open, and a flash of brown fur darted out across the porch steps. The pup was fast, full of bark and energy that seemed too big for his small frame. He circled the garden twice before darting straight into a rake, knocking it over with a clang that sent birds scattering from the trees. Maude did not flinch. She stepped slowly into the light, leaning on the cane that now supported her right side, and looked at the chaos unfolding in her yard. "Ranger!" she called calmly. The pup stopped mid-spin, turned, and bounded back toward her, skidding to a halt just shy of her boots. She crouched slowly, one hand steadying herself on her knee, the other reaching out to stroke the top of his head. "You will learn," she murmured. "Everything worth protecting takes time." Each morning she walked the fields again. Not all the way to the borders. Those paths were longer now, and her legs still stiffened when the air turned cold, but enough to let the land see her, to let it know she had not forgotten what it cost to hold it. The cane tapped against the dirt with a rhythm that had replaced the weight of a rifle, but it did not mean less. She paused often at the edge of the garden, at the slope that overlooked the creek, at the small patch of earth where the blood had soaked deepest. And she looked not for intruders, but for life, a new sprout, a bird's nest in the fence post, the tracks of a deer she had seen once, but never again. And when she stood at the center of the highest field, the one where the wind always came first, she let her gaze sweep wide across the open ground, then down to the house, then back again. She said the same thing each time, not loudly. Not for anyone to hear, except maybe the land itself. "I am still watching." The breeze carried the words across the grass, past the repaired fences and fresh turned soil into the hollows, where voices once whispered threats, and now only echoed the sound of leaves turning over in the wind. Behind her, the house stood firm. Ahead the horizon waited, not for war, not anymore, but for whatever came next. The grave was tucked at the edge of the north pasture beneath a canopy of sugar maples that dropped golden leaves in October, and a cool hush year-round. Maude had not been there in 10 years, not because she had forgotten, not because grief had turned her away, but because the silence between them had always been understood. He had once told her that real love did not need constant tending, that their bond was rooted deeper than words, deeper than place, deeper than time itself. Still that morning she rose early, dressed without looking in the mirror, and walked the full stretch from the house to the tree-line with a slow, deliberate grace that did not ask the land's permission. It already knew her weight. She brought no flowers, just the flash drive. It fit between her fingers like something far older than a modern device, more like a coin worn smooth by purpose, its contents heavier than plastic could explain. She knelt with care, her knees resisting the movement, but not enough to stop her. The dew had not burned off yet, and the chill touched the hem of her coat as she reached forward and slid the flash drive beneath the corner of the stone. It was not meant to last there. But it was meant to mark something, a final act, not of vengeance, but of closure. The headstone was plain, just the way he had asked for. No rank, no war dates, no platitudes, just his name, and beneath it the words, "Stand quiet. See far," their old field mantra etched in stone. She sat back on her heels, exhaled once through her nose, and let the breeze carry her voice. "They came here thinking I would fold," she said, her tone even, steady, not softened by sentiment, but not hardened by pain either. "Thought this old house was just that, old. Thought I was past fighting. Thought you were not still here." She glanced toward the horizon, then back to the name in the stone. "But you married a sniper." The silence settled again, but it was not empty. It was full, stretched wide like the pause before a sunrise, waiting only for memory to rise. And with that, the air around her seemed to slow, and what followed was not seen, but remembered. A flash of heat, her younger self, hair pinned under a cap, breathing through the scope at the edge of some distant hill, heartbeat synced with the wind, eyes sharp and unshaken, the grip of the rifle steady, her finger poised, not out of aggression, but duty. Then the softer warmth of her husband's laugh, sun-soaked and reckless, echoing from a jeep parked outside a tent in Kandahar. Him teasing her about how she never missed, how she made even silence feel tactical. She had rolled her eyes but smiled anyway because he was the one person who never looked at her like she needed fixing. Another memory bloomed. The night he brought her to this land, told her the soil was good, that it had veins of strength running through it, just like her. They had stood on this very field and watched the sky turn from copper to indigo, not saying much, just letting the future wrap around them without fear. And then that last conversation years later, right before he left for that meeting, the one that cost him everything, his hand on her shoulder, the words he did not say but did not need to. And her promise unspoken, that if anything ever happened, she would hold the line no matter what shape the threat took. She blinked once slowly, and the present returned. Her fingers grazed the edge of the stone, not to clean it, not to fuss, just to feel that it was still there, that he was still here, not watching from above, not whispering from the trees, but resting. Because now, finally, she could tell him it was done. She rose, using the cane for balance, and stood facing the pasture. Ranger sat nearby, watching with a tilt to his head, as if he knew this was not just another walk. "You can rest now," she said, not to the wind, not to the earth, but directly to the space between them. And with that, she turned and made her way back down the worn path toward the house, the cane tapping steady rhythm against the ground, the flash drive tucked safe beneath the stone, and the sun rising strong behind her back. The camera crew arrived late in the afternoon, their van rolling up the gravel path with cautious tires, as if even their equipment understood it was trespassing on sacred ground. Maude had agreed to the interview only after they promised two things: that she would have the final word and that nothing would be edited to soften the truth. No narration, no dramatization, no pity. She wore a dark blue button-down shirt, sleeves rolled just past the wrist, and a silver pin at the collar that once belonged to her husband. Ranger lay by her feet as the director adjusted sound levels and tried not to stare too long at the rusted traps lying neatly on a shelf behind her. The old barn, now swept clean, smelled faintly of cut wood and earth, as if it too had been preparing for this conversation. When the camera blinked red, she did not speak right away. She let the air hold, let the cruise shift uncomfortably into silence. Then, her eyes fixed past the lens steady as the scope she had once lived behind, she began, not with a dramatic retelling of the night's violence, but with the soil. "They did not come here for the house," she said. "Did not care much for the fence or the well, or even the grass. They came for what was buried, and they thought I would not know how to fight for something I could not see." She did not raise her voice, did not flinch when they asked if she regretted anything. Instead, she told them about history. Not the kind written in textbooks, but the kind written in deeds filed late, signatures forged, land taken without gunfire, just pressure and silence and slow erasure. She spoke not like a victim, but like a sentinel, someone who had seen the pattern long before the world caught up. The footage aired 3 weeks later in a prime-time slot with minimal promotion. And still it spread like wildfire. Something about her presence, her refusal to be softened or made symbolic, resonated deeper than the producers expected. What began as a profile on a lone landowner resisting a corporate assault became a national reckoning because hidden in the records Maude had helped surface alongside Selena's tireless documentation was a pattern that spanned 3 states, 5 different counties, 7 families, all black, all targeted for mineral rights beneath land long written off as forgotten. One company name showed up on every paper trail, though never at the top. Shell corporations with names like Green Horizon LLC and Southern Future Ventures. Auction house signatures from frontmen with no digital footprint. Land agents who disappeared when subpoenas were issued. But the dots connected. And when they did, the federal probe expanded. By the time the indictments were unsealed, over a dozen officials had resigned or been placed under investigation. Maude's own case, once just a backwoods anomaly, now anchored a national scandal. She turned down every speaking engagement, every podcast, every guest lecture invitation. She did not want to be turned into a brand, but she agreed to sit for one last segment. Months later, filmed quietly on her porch with no makeup crew, no microphone clipped to her collar, just her voice and the steady rustling of the wind through the stalks. "I do not need a statue," she said. "Just leave the land alone. Let it rest the way we never got to." And so the last shots of the broadcast were not of boardrooms or courtrooms, but of her hands planting new seedlings near the edge of her property. The same place where her husband once swore they would grow their own food again, even if the world forgot how. Ranger nosed at the soil beside her, tail thumping, ears twitching in the breeze. In the distance, the rebuilt shed cast a shadow in the shape of a rifle rack, now empty. The wood polished but unarmed. A flag flew on a short pole nearby. Not the national one, but a faded green banner with the initials of her husband's old unit stitched by hand. The land did not feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like memory finally given space to breathe. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.